stand here and do, half an hour on how sexist the whole tech industry is. You all know that already, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to concentrate on specifically what aspects of it we could do better in, but why we've actually got such divides in some places as well. And one of the things that interests me, is, which is, by the way, a very niche, is why we gender things in the first place, why we gender technology. And there's clearly some purpose to it because we find it easy to talk to conversational interfaces. And so I was wondering, where does this all come from? And there are a lot of myths that have sprung up about why we do this. And there's a lot of unconscious bias creeping in, so I wanted to address that. If we think about the origins of AI, we think about the stories that we've told across the centuries, we can trace it right back to things like Greek myth. And one of the earliest creation myths was that of Pandora. Okay, so Pandora was created by a team of gods, a bit like programmers, who each gave her a different attribute. And I particularly like this image of Pandora being bequeathed gifts. By the way, obviously it's the Greek gods, it doesn't all go smoothly. And so, terrible things happened. And she got the blame because she's a woman, setting up a story that runs for centuries. But why I like this particular image from a Greek vase is that it really reminds me of this, which is one of the earliest depictions of a robot in film. This is from Metropolis, again, where we have a female robot, and it all goes terribly wrong. Because the female robot is evil, and there's a threat to humanity, and we have the same story. So we are set up through years and years of narrative to expect a particular thing to happen when we gender our machines. The AI Narratives project at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence has had a really nice look at this, and is doing a lot of work on this as well. So in terms of what we have around today, of course, we have the conversational interfaces that all began as female voiced. Even though when Siri was released in the UK, Siri suddenly adopted a male British accent. But Siri actually originally was a woman talking into a microphone. It was a voice artist who was recorded and did not know that she was going to become the voice of Siri. And people do gender their machines. We impose ideas of gender upon them. We associate traits of femininity and personality based on the way that they sound and the way that they look. And if you talk to, my phone's just about to run out of battery, so I'm not going to do this, but I was going to talk to Siri. If you ask Siri what gender he, she, it is, you want to do a demo, Joe? You can. Siri on. Hey Siri, what gender are you? Siri's not on. Well, I press the home button. Yeah. Siri's not on. Siri doesn't want to answer. Siri doesn't want to play. Siri will say, right, I don't have a gender. But we know that's not true. And there's been, if we look a bit closer, we can see that that is not the case. Siri is not genderless. And Julia Dick's article in 2017 explored this in more detail. And she had said, the very earliest telephone operators in the 50s and 60s to women's voices used for announcements. Female voices have been speaking for technologies throughout history, but the voices of women and the opinions of women have largely not been heard while those technologies were being designed. And we can see this reflected in things like Apple developing a health tracker that couldn't track the menstrual cycle, or Siri is able to recognise someone having a heart attack but can't recognise rape or domestic violence. So this is very gendered processes going into that. And I'm not saying that this was done deliberately, but I think unconscious bias has a lot to answer for. But why do we even have personalities in our conversational bots at all? And of course the obvious answer is that's the easiest way for us to interact. Conversational interfaces have proved immensely popular because we are social beings, we are social animals. Back in 1994, Clifford Nass's paper on computers are social actors explored this, and it became a really fundamental and foundational paper for developers in HDI. It looked at how we relate to technology, and it found that we relate socially, even with the slightest interactions, even if we're typing text into a keyboard.
even if we're getting text back. Before we even get to conversational stage, we're engaging with technology on a social basis. Nass and fellow researchers looked particularly at gender. This was interesting. So they ran a number of studies, and study 4 was, will users apply gender stereotypes to computers? And they wanted to demonstrate that these particular social rules, praise from males is more convincing than praise from females, males who praise are more likable than females who praise, females know more about love and relationship than males. So there's nothing like taking a big bunch of social stereotypes and trying to measure them. And so they did, and this got held up as being some kind of example of, Nass has shown that people are much more likely to respond to the women and think they're more authoritative in terms of love and emotions, and much more likely to want praise from the authoritative male. The study actually used 48 participants, 24 male, 24 female. It was not a large-scale study, and it was quite confined in the questions it was asking. And sure, it does show that gender stereotypes applied in human-human interaction are applied in human-computer interaction when computers employ a gendered voice. So the conclusions from this study was that computers are gendered social actors, and that gender is very powerful as a cue, and that gendered voices is highly consequential. Nowhere in the paper did they recommend that we gender our computers. It was an observation, it was not a recommendation. And I think that we actually have a duty to we can identify the stereotypes, but why we're perpetuating them is a whole other matter. If we go right back to the sort of origins of the chatbot, in the early days, there was Weizenbaum's Eliza. And Eliza was a very compelling chatbot, because even though it was incredibly basic and just running off sort of keywords and script, using the therapist-like approach to be able to interact, people bonded with Eliza, and they bonded with the idea of someone listening to them. And they particularly bonded with the idea that this was a sympathetic woman. And I had a chat with Eliza this morning to ask her, I already gender, what her gender is. Eliza's very evasive because Eliza just wants to draw things out of people. Now, Weizenbaum created Eliza as a bit of a joke to say that people will believe anything, that even they'll think there's an interaction there and there's not. But it just shows that right back in the origins of conversational bots, we were already thinking about how they present. Can we present conversation in a more neutral manner? I think it's pretty difficult, because we're so used to projecting our interpretations of gender onto objects. We anthropomorphize all the time. So there have been a number of different things that people have said are the reasons that we have gendered voices of conversational interfaces. A few years ago, I was doing a talk, and afterwards, someone came up to me and said that they were from the company that built Alexa, and they said that we had no idea, we had no issue about gender, we hadn't deliberately made Alexa female, and a woman standing behind him said, bullshit, really loudly. And I think there's that feeling that, why are we defaulting? There is that unconscious bias there. So I've heard a number of different things, and I want to kind of try and address them. So there's this idea, this myth that, excuse me, it's a well-established phenomenon that the human brain is developed to like human voices. Yes, actually, let's just say women's voices. I completely ruined the point of that slide. To develop to like women's voices. In fact, let me just change that live, right? Oops, can't type either. Okay, that's what it's supposed to say. We're in the punchline. Okay, so it's a well-established phenomenon the human brain is developed like women's voices. So the kind of conversation around that is, well, from the womb there's a distinct preference for people to want to hear a woman's voice because it reminds them of their mother's voice, and their mother's voice is the first voice they hear when they're internal, when they're in the womb. So I thought, well, that sounds reasonable. I'll go and have a look if that's true. And I couldn't find supporting evidence for it. And I asked my friend, who is a psychology working on infant development, who's also writing a book on infant development at the moment. I said, is this true? And he said, well, yes, there's a distinct preference in the first 8 months of life that infants will prefer their mother's voice over anything else. He said, it's not all women, And after 8 months, it kind of tails off. There's no distinction. So yes, we can set up the conversational interface for the first 8 months of the child's life, and then after that, maybe we can rethink it. So that's that myth out of the way. The other one is that female voices are easier to hear because they're higher pitched. In some ways, yes, you can pick out a higher pitch over some ambient noise, but in other ways, no. So there was studies done initially on using female voices in a cockpit so that fighter pilots would be able to distinguish them more clearly. It turns out that a follow-up study showed that the cockpit's actually optimized for male voices because most of the fighter pilots are male. And not only that, but in hearing loss, the higher pitches are the first to go. So it makes more sense to have a male voice in that case. So female voices may seem easier to hear if they're higher pitched and have a slight edge, but it's not. It doesn't make sense right across the board. And then this one, I find this in an article. I've been teaching a class this week on gender and technology and effective labour, and I find this about. It was about conversational interfaces in an article that a UX developer wrote, a UX developer working for Amazon wrote, and they said men and women use language differently, and it would be strange to hear a male voice talking like a woman and vice versa. And this sounded to me like evolutionary psychology bullshit. So I had a look at that as well, and there was a study that showed that men use more words. It's people who are in like a subservient role, or people who are the less dominant figure, less alpha figure in a relationship will tend to use I words more. I did not understand this. I did not do that. I want to help you. And that generally corresponds with women. So they were saying, well, if you have a subservient interface, like Alexa, like Siri, and they say, I'm sorry, I did not understand that. That is something that a woman would say, and therefore it would be very strange if a man said it. I just think, well, it doesn't even make logical sense. I mean, surely you want to shake that up. Yeah, I think there are distinct speech patterns between men and women, but these are socially gendered. These are not some kind of innate thing. So I thought, well, what is going on here? And my conclusion is that, like many things, Silicon Valley are trying to replicate their secretaries and their mothers. And I did a stock image search for secretary, and yeah, it's very gendered. So we have these, the enthusiastic secretary, the sexy secretary phoning, the attractive secretary, the spanking secretary. So yeah, I think we're seeing that kind of thing going on. And even if we say, well, it doesn't matter to me, I would have any kind of conversational interface at all, this is creeping in. So we want to tell someone, we want to give someone orders, we're giving orders to that female persona. The caring one, the nurturing one, the idea that someone is looking out for you, the idea that someone will organise you and remind you to do things. But interestingly, when Apple first mooted the idea of conversational interfaces back in 1987 with Knowledge Navigator, they set it up to be a man.
Just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father's
surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock. You need to take Kathy to the airport by 2. You have a lecture at 4:15 on deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Right.
So from 1987, when Apple were toying with the idea or proposing the idea in the future of some kind of conversational assistant, what happened along the way that it got spun into a default woman. And I think this is where we can clearly see what the differences in the tech industry sprung up around that time. So in the mid to late 80s, we were seeing the rise of the the uber tech geek, the lone figure who drove tech forward, so the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs of the world. And that has become more and more enshrined, and then we have almost rock star-like characters like Zuckerberg, like Elon Musk, people who sort of epitomise the technology and the world that they live in and the whole programmer culture. We know that initially women were taking on the roles of early programmers, of early software engineers. That work was not being valued in the same way, and so they were becoming the more effective side of the labour, the more emotional side of the labour. So when those 50s and 60s telephone operators were chasing, connecting the calls, they were behind the scenes, plugging in cables, switching wires, making the calls transfer, all the while with the service spin on it. So all the while doing the polite voice on the line. And those roles tied in with a lot of economic factors, like the whole Wall Street phenomenon, became more and more entrenched into stereotypes, with women taking on effective and caring labour that is not rewarded in the same way as the big tech bucks. So I think this just really is entrenching the same kind of stereotypes, but I think that we should be doing something about it. I want to talk a little bit about sci-fi because I think that weighs in a lot on how we go, and we can say, yeah, it's just a story. But Her is a really interesting one for me. The film Her, if you haven't seen it, it's about a man who falls in love with his operating system. And the operating system is a very sexy operating system because it's played by Scarlett Johansson. And so although you don't see her, this gender is set up. He gets the choice at the start whether or not his operating system is male or female. He opts for female. The gender is there in the flirtatious voice. It would be a whole different movie if it had been a male one. It could have been a buddy movie, who knows, but this guy was hurting after his divorce, and he needed some kind of hope in the form of a woman that can make him feel love again. It's all very nice. But it's a really, really creepy film because it's almost plausible. And if we think about something like Ashley Madison with the recent data breach in the past couple of years, with Ashley Madison, the people who were using that site, married men who were looking for affairs, had no idea that they were interacting with bots a lot of the time. And of course, most people these days can't be quite sure if they're talking to a bot in a service website or not. I can't either. It's why I find myself sometimes typing thank you and sometimes not, because I just can't quite tell. Usually we can assume it's a bot, but we can't always. So I think this is a really interesting one because the main character has a job where he writes letters, handwritten letters for people. And one of his colleagues says to him, you must be half man, half woman to be able to write like that. He's got this emotional job. He's got some of that emotional labour. But his operating system is seen as, organising his life, being there for him. The idea that she will be there and she will be supportive and provide him with love and affection. Of course, it doesn't quite go like that. And he finds out she's also in love with many other people because she's an AI and an operating system. The film Blade Runner 2049 has a similar thing where it has a gendered AI that allows people to have like a girlfriend experience with a holographic girlfriend as well. Blade Runner 2049 is a bit of a woman problem. The women are sort of divided into the demure girlfriend type, who's sort of manic pixie dream bot, or the cold ruthless killer, or the only woman that's kind of vaguely rounded out in character and lives in a glass bubble. And so it's got all these cliches going on. But the interesting thing with this is that Joy, the AI, she is that girlfriend experience, and very, very gendered, deliberately so, and reminds her owner, reminds Kay that he can upgrade her. He can. So she's just sort of selling her dream as it goes along. She says, "Well, you can upgrade me to a bit that you can take me outside of the app, and I can become like a real woman." But I think this is particularly interesting because the work I've been doing on sex robots for the past few years, the first commercially available sex robot was available to order from May this year and is about to ship any month now. It's made by a company called Abyss Creations in California who make Real Doll. And they have a sex doll body, a high-end silicone sex doll body with an animatronic head. And it's not bad as far as robotics go. It's got quite subtle face movements. It can't do anything from the neck down. But what's interesting is they spent a lot of time working on the AI for it. And they've got a really good user interface for their AI, but it also works, like Joy works, as a standalone AI app. So you can have a girlfriend experience for $20 in an Android app that you can take around with you on your phone. And they said particularly that they wanted the emphasis on companionship. So people will pay upwards of £10,000 when it's eventually being produced. They pay about, sorry, $10,000. They pay about $5,000 upwards now for a doll. They can pay for the robotic version of that doll. It's a bit limited, but they can pay for it. Or they can have the $20 AI. And I see that as being a much more compelling and likely form of technology for relationships and intimacy than I do a doll with unfeasibly large breasts, a tiny waist, and a head that just moves in that much. I want to talk a little bit about Ex Machina because I think, again, we get into the idea of why are we doing this at all. Ex Machina is a really wonderful film for AI, to explore themes in AI, and I was particularly pleased with it, even though I think it's got, again, women problems. I'm particularly pleased with it because it raises very explicitly the issues around gender and sexuality. So I just want to start by playing the trailer for it. This is the American trailer I'm on for. I won't play the trailer. Oh, yeah. Where is it? Okay, maybe I haven't played the trailer.
Maybe it's the same reason we don't see
Oh. Okay, I want to pause it there because the very first line of the American trailer uses a term that annoys me so much. This is the hill I will die on, man and machine. Okay, it just takes 2 more letters to make it human and machine. I realise then you lose the alliteration, but then you feel a little bit more inclusive. Anyway, to erase the line between man and machine, to obscure the line between men and gods, okay? Women don't get a look in here, but it is a programmer film, so we can let that go. And it doesn't end well for men.
Over the next few days, you're going to be the human component in the Turing test.
One day the AIs are going to look back on us the same way we look at fossils.
Hello.
How do you feel about her?
Oh man, she's amazing.
You're impressed.
Yes.
Do you want to be my friend?
Of course. Now the question is, how does she feel about you?
Do you think about me when we are together?
Did you give her sexuality as a diversion tactic?
This is your insecurity talking. This is not your intellect.
Did you know that I was brought here to test you?
Does Ava actually like you? Or is she pretending to like you?
Nathan isn't your friend. I'm wrong.
Wrong about what?
Everything. Do you want to be with me?
Can we talk about the lies you've been spinning me?
What lies? What lies?
You have to help me. You have to help me. What will happen to me if I fail your test?
It's a great film because it raises so many fundamental questions around things like consciousness and deception and things of that nature. But I was interested in that bit about, did you give her sexuality as a diversion tactic? Because very clearly the film is set up so that Ava, the female robot character, is gendered as female with a sexy female, not just a female. And there's, there we go. And so there's this really nice bit in the script where Caleb said, why did you give her sexuality? An AI doesn't need a gender. She could have been a grey box. And this is kind of the first thing I thought of when we thought about conversational AIs. Why are we giving them genders? They could have been a grey box. Well, it's hard to give a voice, make a neutral voice. We can do a robotic type voice, yes, but there are elements of gender that play into that. I think Pepper the robot sort of addresses that in that Pepper is ambiguous in gender because Pepper is made to be childlike, in height, in shape, in tone of voice. But this bit really fascinated me. So Nathan, the creator, replies, actually, I'm not sure that's true. Can you think of an example of consciousness at any level, human or animal, that exists without a sexual dimension? This was one of the reasons I got onto researching sex robots. I was thinking, it maps onto initial ideas about AI in terms of being goal-oriented behaviour. So whether we like it or not, we're all here because our parents had sex, generally. And since 1978, there's ways around that where you can have in vitro fertilisation, but we are existing because of that. Fundamentally, that is part of our makeup, and there's maybe something inescapable in that we're driven by it. So perhaps we are programmed in a way, like AI, to have a goal-oriented behaviour. But the other thing that I thought was interesting from that is the idea that sex is a social thing, that it sort of maps onto later ideas about AI, ideas about ecological perspective, ideas about sensory motor perspectives, where the sociality and the being in the world and the embodiment and having a body is a way of how we interpret things and think about things. So I thought that was just really interesting. So is that what we're trying to do when we create these AIs and we create robots like this? Are we trying to gender them because it makes an understanding of our world? And conversely, can they gain a better understanding of the world? Can we push forward AI? Can we push forward robotics if they experience the world in that way? I'm not saying they necessarily should, but is there something in that? So I think the state that we're in at the moment, we are seeing a lot of technology that reflects the creators in a big way, and we've seen that from anything from seatbelts that were originally designed for a male body through to phones that have got bigger and bigger in size, so that women's hands are about, on average, about 17 millimeters narrower than men's hands. And don't even start me on pockets, because you don't have pockets to put the damn things in. So I think there's a lot of things that don't get thought about. The first pacemaker was designed for the male body. It was something like 20 years before a pacemaker was designed for a female body. It wasn't built for that. So I think what we're seeing in technology so often is not an intentional sexism, but just an unconscious bias that the UX is entirely geared towards the default male category. And okay, that's how the world is generally set up. So when we see things, when we hear our conversational interfaces having these gendered voices that are particularly female, that we're giving orders to female voices all the time, I'm saying disrupt the narrative. Just because it's been the way it's done, just because people say we prefer to do that, doesn't mean we should do it. And I think we do have some kind of duty to be able to introduce more fairness by disrupting that and by trying to work in other means of interaction. And to me, AI and interaction is still very much in the early phases. We're getting a lot of advances in things like machine learning, but with the actual interface between the user and the AI, there's still a long way to go. So we see changes. We've seen the changes in technology and software. We've seen it go from a skeuomorphic stage where we try to mimic, we use metaphors like the desktop metaphor, right through to much more abstraction. And I think we're going to hopefully see the same with the development of these conversational interfaces as well. But there's still a lot of work to be done on it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. As Joe very kindly plugged this, there's much more on this, much more on sex robots in my book that's out on Thursday. But yeah, I just want to stop there and see if anyone has any questions or wants to raise any points about it. Thanks.